All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Connecting the Dots from Vulnerabilities to Patient Harm. My name is Alicia Bond, and I have the pleasure of being today's moderator and, of course, introducing our esteemed panel of experts. Before we get started, though, I just wanted to walk through a couple of housekeeping items. If time permits today, we would love to be able to take some questions from the audience. So please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to enter any questions you might have. If we don't get to your question, we will do our best to summarize those with responses and email the audience that along with the recording of today's webinar. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to today's panel members. Joining us today is Kyle Rose. Welcome, Kyle. Kyle is a seasoned quality and regulatory consultant with over 12 years of experience advising medical device companies around the world. Kyle has led programs for NIH, including RADx initiative, supporting over 100 COVID diagnostic devices. He's also an advisor to multiple Fortune 500 companies on quality and regulatory strategy, and he actively mentors medical device incubators, hospital systems, accelerators, and universities. As the founder of Rook Quality Systems, Kyle brings a deep understanding of building practical, scalable, and compliant QMS frameworks, especially for innovative and early stage companies. Welcome, Kyle. Also with us today is Chad Williams, Senior Engineering Director and Head of Radiology Cybersecurity at Bayer. Chad brings over 20 years of R&D experience in regulated environments, including 17 years in the medical device industry. He currently leads a team focused on designing security for healthcare software and medical devices. Chad is a recognized expert in medical device software and cybersecurity standards, and he actively contributes to working groups such as AdvaMed, the Medical Imaging Division of AdvaMed, and HSCC. Chad also has been a featured speaker at top industry events such as RAPS Convergence, INCOSE Health Summit, and the Connected Medical Devices Cybersecurity Summit, and others. Thank you so much for joining us today, Chad. Rounding out our panel is Ken Zalevsky, CEO and founder of Vigilant Ops, a leader in SBOM lifecycle management and medical device cybersecurity. Ken has spent over 25 years in cybersecurity with a deep focus on software supply chain and securing critical infrastructure, including connected medical technologies. He's a frequent speaker at major industry events, and he actively works with manufacturers, regulators, and industry to advance best practices with SBOMs, vulnerability management, cybersecurity, and regulatory readiness for the healthcare and medtech sectors. So again, thank you so much for joining us, to the audience and to our panel members. Let's go ahead and get started. So let's start by actually level setting, I think, on patient harm. So when we talk about patient harm in the context of cybersecurity, really what exactly does that mean? And what are the current expectations, that the regulators like FDA have and others similar to FDA? I'm gonna ask Chad to get us started with that.
Sure, Alicia, thank you. So when we talk about patient harm, we need to start by understanding that cybersecurity risks can lead to the compromise of the safety and effectiveness of a medical device. And this can potentially lead to a patient being harmed. And what do we mean by harm? This can be in the form of delays in diagnosis or availability of a device, or other hazards that can lead to injury or even death. So the FDA has set a pretty high bar from a regulatory perspective with respect to cybersecurity and their latest pre-market guidance. This includes considerations for integrating it into MDM's quality management systems. They're aligning their thinking to standards like AAMI TIR 57, TIR 97, and IEC 81001-5-1 for secure product development frameworks, and they're adding increasing rigor around the assessments and management of cybersecurity risks. The FDA has gone so far as to specifying in their latest pre-market guidance the expectations around technical security controls in categories like authorization, authentication, cryptography, and more. Other regulatories across the globe, including the EU, are raising the bar with respect to demonstrating cybersecurity in a device's design as well, and they all expect you to manage it throughout the total product lifecycle.
Ken or Kyle, anything to add?
I'd be happy to jump in first. So yeah, thank you, Chad. That was great to level set and really describe patient harm and the connection to cybersecurity. And I think, what you mentioned there and the FDA's requirements around cybersecurity. And I think as we get into this discussion more, we can ferret out what that actually means from an alignment. You mentioned the alignment of safety and security. There's always that crosswalk between the TIR framework and the safety and security crosswalk. But I think what a lot of folks forget is on one side is the cybersecurity vulnerability, but you brought up a really good point. What's the actual impact of that vulnerability to the patient, and is there an impact, and how do you assess that? And so we'll dig into that as we go more, but I think it's a great way to start. And I'll turn it over to Kyle, see if he's got any comments.
Yeah, just to align, my role is more on kind of the back end, the quality, documentation, the regulatory scope. And so a lot of this patient harms really ties back to your foundational risk analysis and what you're doing with the device, how you're analyzing risk and identifying kind of what your device does and then what potentially could go wrong, and then kind of forward and backwards how that ties to cybersecurity and eventually patient harms, really. So it's a lot of this is the foundational stuff too, of making sure all your risk analysis has been thought out, documented, discussed, reviewed, both for your product, but any other similar products on the market, to get that full scope of what could affect the patient for a variety of scope within the scope of cybersecurity.
Actually, Kyle, you made me think of something. If you don't mind, I'd love to maybe expand on that, because I think what you said, I think is it makes me think that manufacturers have experience with this today, right? With respect to analyzing that risk, and they've been doing that for a long time. As you just mentioned there, it's part of their quality system, it's part of the documentation they've been putting together. But now we're kind of expanding that a little bit by saying take into account this security measure, right? And maybe that's kind of a little different direction, maybe, and that's maybe something to expand on too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the big scopes of cybersecurity. Is not just the safety of the device, but also the broader security of your device, but how it interacts with the rest of the system, right? So it's not just your device alone, it's the SBOM and everything that goes into your software, the additional soup aspects, but also down the line of what things that are going to be integrated with your software, where this data is going to go, and how that comes from your device or output from your device. So I think that security aspect is kind of this new approach to looking at this risk and identifying if there are additional harms that might come up down the road from this additional scope. And I'm sure Chad has some experience with that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we should be clear that we need to make sure that we maintain separate but interrelated processes for security, risk estimation, and safety estimation. And this is what it kind of outlines in the AAMI TIR 57 guidance. Essentially, you estimate everything with respect to security risk, and then can it potentially harm a patient? And if so, then you hand it off to your safety risk management process to then take it from there to do the estimation for understanding what levels of risk you have, and then, of course, its acceptability.
That's great. Yeah. And I think our next question, you may have already started to kind of address it, to be honest, but maybe pull at it slightly more or maybe another angle. So the next question would be, how do you define the connection between a software vulnerability and actual patient harm? So kind of pulling at that same topic, where is that line drawn in risk analysis? Kyle, do you want to get us started on that one?
Sure. Yeah, I'm already off mute, so might as well jump on. But yeah, I think a lot of this ties back to some of the similar framework, right? So for companies that are developing a new software, developing a new medical device, it's really connecting all the aspects of your software, all the features requirements of what does the software do, how does it create a result, what is the output it gets, and then tying that back to your actual threat. So how could this be exploited? What could go wrong, both in the actual safety aspect and the security aspect too, right? So there's two aspects of this scope. So identifying what could go wrong or what could be exploited to create a vulnerability, and then identifying what these vulnerabilities are, right? So you start to populate this information and you get a list of these are the different types of vulnerabilities we have and how they fall within the different process of our software. And then you start to, evaluate these, right? How can they be exploited and what is the impact of this vulnerability or exploitation, right? So once you start to go through this process, you start to come to, how does this actually tie to harm and what is the risk of each of these harms? And this is something that, is easy to talk about, but when you're actually doing this process, it's very detailed. It takes a lot of stakeholders from, your company within both the development side, the risk and evaluation side, the regulatory scope, and the cybersecurity scope to make sure that you're covering all the bases of this information. And like Chad said, the FDA guidances, the TIR standards, are asking for more and more information. So this is a very detailed process to make sure that you have your full team involved, but you start early to kind of incorporate this process from your development, but also to make sure that you don't get too far in development and realize you didn't think about any of this and you've got a lot of backtracking to do and a lot of vulnerabilities that might have been prevented had you developed it from the start with a broader framework. So I think that's kind of the high level process of really looking through what your software does, what threats there are, and how they can be exploited, and then building your features and risk around that.
I think one key thing to highlight on how you said that, Kyle, which was great, it was very well stated, how a vulnerability can be exploited, not if a vulnerability will be exploited. A lot of historical IT security risk management methodologies take into context motivation of a bad actor. But when we're dealing with safety, the regulators really want us to look at what can go wrong, not will somebody attempt to make it go wrong. So when you read in the FDA guidance, they talk about exploitability rather than likelihood. So we need to make sure that we're focusing on, if it can go wrong, what is the exploitability of that vulnerability, and not what is the likelihood that somebody's going to try to make it go wrong.
Yeah, I like that, and I like both what Kyle and Chad said, and I think we haven't mentioned at all like the specific tools and things that are out there to help folks do this. But as you were saying that, Chad, I was thinking about the software bill of materials and using that for transparency into the vulnerability. But both you and Kyle brought up the point that understanding the vulnerability is kind of the start, but you got to understand the context of that device in the ecosystem and how that vulnerability, to your point, can be exploited. Not if it will be exploited, but can it be? What would be the impact if it is, and those kind of things. And so that's a great point to kind of level set. I think that you start with this transparency and understanding what's in there, but there's that analysis that continues and it has to happen with respect to the actual impact of those vulnerabilities. So yeah, good dialogue, good discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, Ken. Oh, since I had you off mute, I thought I'd pick on you a little bit.
Sure.
And ask you what do healthcare and medtech organizations like? What do you see them overlook, right? When they assess cyber risks in relation to patient safety or patient harm.
And I think it's, I started to say it there a little bit and maybe jump the gun on the answer, but I feel like it's kind of blends together in all lines. I mean, you want to understand the vulnerabilities in the software that you're writing, the devices that you're building, and that's kind of step one. But I think what's often overlooked is we just kind of talked about there the continuous monitoring and understanding of vulnerabilities that pop up against those components and the potential impact of those vulnerabilities against the functioning of that device. And the requirement is this is and Chad and Kyle know this is an ongoing continuous process. It's not a one and done. I got an SBOM or I know my components, I've done my risk analysis. and I'm done. This is continuous because vulnerabilities are popping up continuously, and depending on how the code's written, the architecture of the software, the source components that you use, those vulnerability impacts are very different. And so even across organizations, the same vulnerability has different impacts. So, in companies that have multiple product lines that are using the same components, you're not necessarily looking at the same impact of that vulnerability in those components across separate products. So there's even that analysis to the product itself. And so I think a lot of folks overlook that step in there, that understanding the vulnerability and the criticality of that vulnerability from like a national vulnerability database with a CVS score of 8.0 is step one. But now you've got to do all that work to figure out what that means to you, and what that means to your product, the product line, the components you're using, dependencies, what other components depend on that component that could be impacted as well. And I think that's where a lot of it, I think manufacturers start that way. They start to do some of that stuff, and then I think it very quickly gets out of control if you're not using automated tools. And so I think that's where I see a lot of that gap happening, is that analysis is not deep enough, or maybe doesn't cover enough to really make that alignment that needs to be made. And I'll turn it over to the other guys as well to chime in.
Yeah, Ken, you talked about depth of the analysis. That's key, because a lot of off-the-shelf third-party software components come with other off-the-shelf software components embedded into them. A great example of this is Log4j or Log4j, depending on your developer speak. But Log4j, there was a major vulnerability, for those that aren't familiar, that was released a couple years ago, and it was embedded into so many other softwares that it created havoc across multiple industries. And we had to scramble and try to identify every single system that had it embedded within its software, embedded within that software, embedded within that software. You get down to multiple levels where you're peeling back the onion, and it becomes challenging to understand, okay, if it is there, we've identified it, then how is it being used? Is it exposed such that that vulnerability can potentially be exploited? And if so, what are the impacts of that once that happens? That becomes a very complicated situation, especially when you have thousands of pieces of software that you're managing. This can be a challenge for medical device manufacturers or software developers, but also at the end user with the hospitals and HDOs, where they're trying to identify these items within their products. So having visibility and transparency, to your point, Ken, with the automation, I think is key, and being able to identify these things as quickly as possible and understanding what components you have is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think Ken, you also talked on one point earlier about how this is kind of the full life cycle as well, right? It's not just a one-time thing. This is something that affects your product for the full life cycle. And so it has to be a proactive thing where you're continually monitoring the cybersecurity, any bug fixes, any updates to your device. Just kind of browsing through the mod database for cybersecurity stuff earlier today, preparing for this, and you see a lot of companies that are kind of affected by that. They don't have proper patch protocols. They can't update software appropriately for cybersecurity measures. So that's something that companies need to plan along with their full development cycle, is that you will have to maintain these measures throughout the full life cycle. So everybody develops software hoping it's going to be out there and be used a ton and ongoing long life cycle, but really making sure that both your quality and your ongoing software development practices align with these measures, and making sure you maintain this throughout the full life cycle. And then even some of the recent guidances align with kind of how it ties back to your quality too, right? So all of your CAPA processes, your complaint, your adverse events, all these things are affected by these cybersecurity measures as well. So it's not just an ISO thing in your design file and your risk and your software documentation. It covers the broader scope of your quality and regulatory documentation as well.
Yeah, I love that, and I gotta add this. I mean, at least I feel like it's worth saying this. I find it really interesting that FDA, with the pre-market guidance that's out there today, is requiring a kind of post-market plan for devices even before they approve them for pre-market sale. So in the past, pre and post-market was kind of there was a delineation, but now and it makes sense. I mean, if you're going to put a product out there, we just talked about how vulnerabilities pop up continuously. They have to be analyzed. They have to be figured out what the impact is. But you got to have a plan to do that on a consistent basis too. So I think that's another, thing that I think folks need to realize, that even up front and when you're designing and thinking about products, you already need to be thinking about security and maintaining those over you, as you just said, Kyle, over the life cycle of that product, of that device in the field. I mean, your hope is it's going to be used over many years, but you got to support it over those years, and you got to have, not only that, but you got to have a plan to support it, and you got to show that to FDA even before you go out the gate. So it's really critical, for manufacturers to start thinking that way. We always say it's kind of like that left shift mentality, where you're thinking more up in the pipeline, where you're developing, designing product, and you're thinking security kind of ahead of time. But I love that. That's a good point.
Yeah, and I think depending on the audience, it's smaller companies versus bigger companies. I think as smaller companies that are developing their first software, it's something you need to realize that you're going to have to dedicate resources through the entire life cycle of the product, right? It's not going to go away. It's one of the things that we always have trouble trying to really get companies to realize, is that this quality and risk and design documentation, cybersecurity is a full role, multiple roles throughout the life cycle. Tools like Vigilant Ops, things like that are critical to make sure that you're complying with regulations throughout the full life of this device. And similar big companies as well, like it's going to get passed from, oh, it got launched, to a new product, new division, new owners, right? They all need to communicate and make sure they're working together to update these patches, keep everything compliant throughout the life cycle of the product. So I think it's very critical for different sized companies, but it's critical for all.
Yeah, and I love, I mean, because you guys just tied that all together with regards to being proactive, right? And just the simple fact that over 70 new vulnerabilities are discovered daily, staying on top of that is not easy. It's a very complex, to your point. Everyone kind of said it. Chad mentioned the complexity is just, it's massive, and a lot of different stakeholders. So really important. We do have a question that is really aligned with, and maybe you guys covered most of this, but I want to make sure we address if some of the details that Kent pulls out here. So thank you for the question. Trying to understand a pre-market cybersecurity assessment or threat model as compared to a post-market cybersecurity assessment threat model. That process of updating that threat model and the data used to update it. Can you touch on that? What is the difference, CVSS scoring, between a pre-market threat model assessment and a post-market assessment? Updates based on newly identified vulnerabilities and threats. What else? So I know you guys kind of touched on that, but maybe just to dig a little deeper.
I'm happy to take that one, Alicia.
Great.
So with respect to your threat model, threat models are a total product life cycle element that you want to maintain within your design history file. You want to do the threat model as part of your early design and development, but you want to maintain it throughout the life. So as new vulnerabilities become extant, you want to then include them into your threat model and progressively update it. This could be either periodically or at time when you're designing a new release, but it should be maintained to really understand that threat surface. And on the question of the difference between the vulnerability scoring pre-market and post-market, pre-market, you're doing security risk estimation to understand acceptability. You're trying to determine, is the device as designed acceptable with respect to security risk, and then, of course, safety risk down the line from there. Post-market, you're doing risk prioritization in order to understand how quickly do you need to address these vulnerabilities and based on the exploitability and then the severity of impact from that. So you're going to continue to do that post-market as the vulnerabilities become relevant and available to us, and it's a very useful, valuable work from a security standpoint to ensure that you're maintaining the device security throughout its life cycle.
Awesome. And I don't know, Chad, if it makes sense, like there's the CVSS score itself, but then there's additional scoring. So I don't know, do you want to touch on any of that, or anyone? Ken, it looked like you were maybe going to.
Yeah, no, Alicia, that's a great point. I was on mute there, but I agree, Chad. That was a great way to make the distinction between pre and post. And the only thing I was going to pull in was that to Alicia's exact point is the other thing that you're looking at after the product is post market is other scoring of the security vulnerability. So if there are other, the EPSS exploitability score, which can be factored in. There's the KEV if it's a known exploited vulnerability. And to your point, Chad, that information should all be taken into account as you reevaluate your threat model and understand that vulnerability. Now you're looking at, what's the potential impact, and how's this vulnerability potentially been exploited or will be exploited in the wild, and taking that into account when it's post-market is certainly recommended for sure. So thank you.
Yeah,
It's a good point.
yeah, no, and I love, Chad, that was so succinct. The pre-market, it's acceptability, post-market, it's prioritizing and figuring out and going after what's most critical, right? So I love that. It was just it's so obvious, but not, right? So that's awesome. We actually have another question. I think that it's kind of flowing a bit in this direction. So why not? Let's just address it now. This is from Jana. Can you please touch upon cybersecurity metrics from FDA's guidance on cybersecurity and medical devices? The guidance doesn't seem to be clear on what the expectations and deliverables are. And I love that question because I know even when we start looking at the vulnerabilities, and you guys are going to dive into this, but my understanding is they have to do patient harm for any new vulnerability that's discovered, right? But the medical device manufacturer then has to, you guys know better than I, so who wants to start us off? Ken, maybe, Chad? Awesome.
Yeah, I'm always. I was trying to give the other guys a chance because I've been talking a lot.
Good.
Yeah. So with respect to the metrics, the FDA, I understand that there's a lot of confusion around this element with respect to the guidance. My recommendation is to just align with the specifics that they have initially that are in the guidance, basically to the word. So they ask you about percentage of identified vulnerabilities that are updated or patched, or also known as defect density. You set a start time and an end time, be able to show them that you're managing patching throughout the life cycle. I think that's really what they want to see, is for you to prove out through your cybersecurity program that you're doing your vulnerability management and patching. Duration of a vulnerability from when it's identified to when it's updated and patched, that's pretty straightforward. There's some tools out there that might be able to help you automate that. And then duration from when an update or patch is available to complete implementation and devices deployed in the field, or to the extent known. And yes, I do have it up in front of me. I pretty much always have this guidance open, so I am reading from it. But the approach that I recommend taking is align with that as closely as you can. And also understand that if you're designing a new device, some of these elements may not be available yet in the U.S. market. So you may just have to state, these are our plans on how we're going to capture these metrics versus just providing, empty data. That's probably the best way that I can think of to align with it.
I think that's great, Chad. I do have a question for you, kind of aligned with this. So with these, how often are you monitoring and measuring or tracking these metrics? Is it a monthly meeting? Is it part of your daily stand-ups? What are you guys doing to make sure you're on top of these metrics, and how frequently are you analyzing and kind of making decisions based on this data?
Yeah, we're maintaining it live, and then we manage it as part of our quarterly quality reports. And we've taken economies of scale because some of the other regulatory bodies expect you to maintain the quality reports and keep the metrics from a safety and quality standpoint. So utilizing that as kind of our benchmark to start and kind of dip our toes in the water and then start to review the output from that on that basis, I think has been pretty effective. We are maintaining the data on a monthly basis because that's how often we conduct our periodic scan analysis as of now. And of course, we're trying to aim to improve that over time with automation.
Yeah, because we kind of build it into our quarterly management review and have some monthly checks too. But I was just kind of wanting to get your feedback as well. It's kind of how can we improve that for our clients as well, just to make sure we are doing enough and staying on top of these things. Obviously, there's some urgent ones that'll come up, but yeah, really want to get your thoughts on that kind of cadence of monitoring and discussing these metrics.
It's good to hear we're aligned on that.
Nice. Nice. And we've got another question here, so let's just go ahead and address this one as well. Does the manufacturer need to have two processes, one that follows ISO 14971 and one that follows TIR 57? Or can we work smarter for assessing risks, safety risks, and security risks, and how to connect these processes together? Does anyone have any thoughts on that question? Looks like Kyle, maybe you're.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think you can connect them. I think just identifying within the scope of your risk analysis process, the 14971 is still kind of the higher level umbrella, but having risk and then categorizing where they fall, whether safety, security, or both, right? There are some that overlap, right? So I think that you can kind of merge these process. We have, templates that we've built that kind of align with this as well. So I think there's some framework stuff that we help a lot of our clients with how to kind of set this up and train on these processes internally first to make sure that you are having an efficient process, like the question alluded to, right? If you're going through multiple standards and trying to align with each one independently rather than working together, then that's kind of the opposite of what they want you to do, because it's making more work and more potential for things that don't line up, right? And then that's when you get caught in an audit where you have a risk level here and one risk and a different risk level in somewhere else, right? So I think having kind of a framework of these are the standards that apply, the guidances that apply to our system and our tools that we use, and then this is how we kind of merge them together based on the scope of our product and then the high level risk profile of our products, and then building out your quality documentation and practices around that. I think that's kind of the most efficient process that we try to implement, really, for both, small few person teams to 100-person teams, right?
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more, and I love both those comments. I think that I think it came up twice. Kyle said it and Chad said it too. I think documentation is important. So, as you go through these, as you start to develop these processes or make these alignments, you should be documenting what you're doing, because, these are processes and documents that you can then have to refer to when your question as to how you did the analysis, how the impact was aligned, and things like that. And so, Chad brought up for small organizations, I think, that are just starting out, make sure you document your processes, even if you don't have that information available. Showing that you have a plan to collect that information as it becomes available is also really critical.
Yeah, and when you're documenting into context that the agency wants to see you be able to demonstrate that you're doing a security specific risk analysis and then tying that back to your safety specific methodologies. And it probably be critical to understand that AMI TIR 57 actually links ISO 14971 back to the IEC 80001 series. They tie together. So although you have your ISO 14971 safety risk assessment, TIR that it just kind of pulls them together.
That's great. And great questions. Thank you. Any other comments? That was a lot. That was good. Thank you. So I was wondering if anyone has a real world example where identifying a vulnerability early helped to prevent potential patient harm. Kyle, can I start with you on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some we have. There was one I was doing some research on as well, where St. Jude had a cardiac implant system that they identified a vulnerability and identified that it could easily have drained the battery of these pacemakers, and they were able to firmware patch this before any harm occurred. So that was one that was just like a very broad scope, very very critical device that I think definitely applied. I think a lot of the ones that we've seen more frequently with companies that we're working with directly are tied more to like diagnostics and at-home diagnostic devices, right? So there's kind of the patient harm is broad bucket. A lot of times you're thinking somebody could be severely injured, but also, not receiving your result or not getting accurate diagnosis. Those things are also in the bucket of patient harm. And as we get to this space where there's more monitoring devices for at-home monitoring, more at-home diagnostic stuff, I think we're seeing more of these, that we're kind of proactively evaluating these vulnerabilities and how these could be exploited, and incorporating that into our cybersecurity practices and our cybersecurity risk analysis with products that we work with a lot. We do a lot with the wearable monitoring devices, both consumer-based, but also more prescription-based, as well as the at-home diagnostic market, which is, I think, two areas that are going to rapidly grow over the next 5-10 years. and two areas that are very ripe for this level of risk and exploitation within the scope of cybersecurity. So I think those are things that we've been very hands-on with our companies is how to, build the framework and all this stuff, but how to look at ways that these types of inaccurate diagnosis, loss of data, so you're not able to get your result, or the potential alarms are set with these types of monitoring devices aren't able to be set or alarmed in time are things that we've been really focused on with our specific clients as well.
That's great. Any other examples anyone wants to share?
Yeah, I don't want to get too specific here, and I don't think I need to, but as working for an MDM, I think there's many real world instances where this can occur. Many devices, as we've mentioned a couple times throughout this webinar, are incorporating third-party off-the-shelf software components. And as you mentioned, Alicia, the vulnerabilities are becoming extant over time. You're seeing 70 per month, I'm sorry, 70 per day with respect to some of these components. So making sure that we're performing, the constant vulnerability management, scanning, assessment, also doing it as part of your design and development stages to help expose those vulnerabilities as early on as you can and make sure you're addressing them as early as you can, is absolutely critical. And that's going to be the best way to ensure that you're protecting your patients from the potential harm from a vulnerability.
Yeah, and that's a good point, and you're exactly right, Chad. And I feel the same way. I mean, there's a variety, a plethora of ways that these vulnerabilities can be exploited for patient harm, and I think there's some real world examples that have occurred over the years, and historically, we've seen things as dangerous as a patient being denied service and then later passing away because that service was denied. And to Kyle's point, though, I think there's also this whole piece of risk that we're just kind of seeing the tip of the iceberg at this point. That patient harm is a fatality, of course, but then there's all kinds of other spectrum of patient harm where to his point, the diagnostics aren't available, or the device that you're using is not providing feedback to your clinician, so you don't get that feedback cycle. And so it's a spectrum of patient harm, but all coming from the same place. We have to be aware that these vulnerabilities and these devices can be used in ways that we didn't intend to them to be used as device manufacturers. And again, I think this goes back to that whole wave of thinking from a security perspective, not just from a safety perspective. And I think that kind of ties it all back together, that we all have to be cognizant of this kind of new world that we're entering with respect to everything's connected, everything's sharing data, everything then is vulnerable, and you got to kind of think that through from the entire spectrum, what it means from diagnostics all the way through to, as we said, could end up in a fatality as well. But yeah.
Yep, makes sense. So we were kind of going along that path just naturally with this discussion with regards to the next question. So maybe digging in a little bit deeper, how automation and SBOMs might be used to actually create that traceable path from detection of a vulnerability to, risk mitigation. And so, Ken, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, just pull that thread a little bit and talk a little bit more on how automation can help folks.
Sure, yeah, happy to do that. So you started saying there, Alicia, and we mentioned a couple times the software bill of materials, and probably it goes without saying, but just quickly, software bill of materials is really that list of software components that are running in a system, an endpoint, or a device. So if we think about a medical device, all the software that's in there, we're kind of enumerating that, like analogous to a list of ingredients on a food package. We're kind of saying these are all the software components that are running in this device. So you start there, and that's just commonsensically gives you that transparency into what's running on that specific system, which, believe it or not, up until software bill of materials, there's no good way to know what's running on that system, especially for hospitals that are implementing these systems on their network. So you start with that, you start to discover what's in there. But I think we said it a couple of times as we've gone through this, that's kind of like step one, understanding what's in there. But more importantly, or maybe just as importantly, is understanding the vulnerabilities against the software that's running inside there. And traditionally, this has been done, and I think it came up a couple of times manually, right? So somebody said they went out and perused the database of vulnerabilities and looked for, kind of tying those back to products and components. And that gets overwhelming very quickly. So you mentioned automation there. There are tools out there today that do this monitoring of vulnerabilities and make this connection back to the components. And strongly recommend that you start, if you're not using something like that, think about some automation there, because it's very even if you have a product that only has a few components, it gets unwieldy very quickly to try to keep up with that. And it's not a good idea to try to manually do that, and you'll miss something along the way for sure. I think the other thing we talked about there is Chad mentioned that deep analysis. So even, so there are complex products out there that are using software that's embedded in software that's embedded in software, and you really got to ferret out those dependencies. And there's automated tools out there that help you do that today, that get to that lowest level of software dependencies. You can kind of trace up the tree to see what's running. And so there are lots of good ways to deploy automation to help you. Those are two of the biggest ones that I see, just maintaining that continuous monitoring and understanding that anytime against that product that you're developing, what the vulnerabilities are against those components and how you would be able to mitigate those.
Yeah, those are great points, Ken. And I was thinking about it along the exact same lines. And we should take into account the criticality of time to patch in some instances. There might be an instance where you have a vulnerability that has a very high potential for exploit that can lead to a pretty severe level of harm. So being able to quickly identify these through automation, through alerts, will save you the time that it would take to stop, get a scan, do the analysis, and then act. So any way that we can make this faster, easier, more efficient is absolutely critical.
Agreed. Yep.
100%. Thank you. We have another question. So let me just read this question from Lynn. For safety risks assessments, the human factors engineering is required. Is it also required when assessing cybersecurity risk?
I would say the human factors risk is tied specifically to the use of the product from personal spend. I think there's some overlap with the cybersecurity risk analysis. I don't think there's a cybersecurity and human factors evaluation that it's more kind of like back end is more cybersecurity versus usability is tied more to the user interaction with the product. So I think it's not a ton of overlap. I think some of the kind of high level things of, getting an account and securing your account and so high level practices tied to general cybersecurity overlap with human factors or usability analysis, but I don't think there's a ton more of overlap. You will still need to do both of them for majority of products, especially direct to consumer products, but I don't think there's a ton of overlap with those two scopes.
One thing to note is the reverse is actually indicated in the guidance, where if you transfer a risk from security to an end user, they do want you to do the human factors analysis on that transferred risk, any type of controls or anything that you put into your system. So though you don't take the human factors risks into cybersecurity, you actually want to take the cybersecurity transfer and then handle it through your human factors analysis.
Chad, that's a great point. I wonder, is it worth to kind of talk about maybe some examples of that? I mean, I love what you're saying there, maybe to help folks understand a little better, because it's really, I think that's a pretty important point.
Yeah, absolutely. So the example that comes to mind would be if you have an alert on your system or in a I don't want to use that term because that has very specific connotation. If you have a message that your system is going to send to an end user to inform them that that a risk is taking place, then having that tested as part of human factors to make sure that it's effective, that they're seeing it, that they're actually acting on it, I think is what the expectation is there.
Right. Yeah. Great example. And then communicating that to your point, communicating that through documentation or through the human interface, as Kyle mentioned, the human factors could come into play there, understanding how to surface that to the end user in the best way. So yeah, good. Thank you. That's good. Good example. I think it was really helpful. Both Kyle and Chad. Thanks.
Yeah. Great. And one more question at the moment. So Kent is asking if we could speak more about understanding the different contexts in which medical devices could be used in, and how that could potentially help understand the potential bad actors in those contexts and therefore influence exploitability. Or do you not recommend that approach? Any thoughts?
I'm wondering if he's speaking to how Ken had indicated earlier that you want to look at a vulnerability in the context of a medical device. What we mean by that is how does a vulnerability display itself as part of the design. So if you have a third-party software component that has a vulnerability in the print spooler service, for instance, and that service requires port 83 to be open. Does the device design have a deny by default firewall that blocks that? If so, the context of that risk is reduced, right? So it means that whenever you're looking at the exploitability of that, it would be far less likely that it could be exploited in the context of that design. Now, when you could also look at it in the context of where the device is deployed, right, in the environment. And when you're looking at your threat model and your security architecture, you do want to take into context that the environment in which it is expected to be deployed, and make sure that either you have designed controls in to reduce risks in the context of that environment, or if you transfer it, make sure that, as Ken mentioned earlier, that you're noting that clearly in the labeling, stating what the expectations are for secure deployment of that device. So that's two different ways that you can look at it with the term context.
Yeah, and just that's great, Chad. Thanks. And just maybe to expand on the kind of the vulnerability analysis. So you made me think of the common vulnerability scoring system, the CVSS, where a score gets attached to that vulnerability. But then manufacturers need to take into account their context of that vulnerability. So you can look at a couple different things. There's a CVSS calculator, which is available online, where you can jump on there and you can set those parameters to your point right there. If you look at the environment in which the device is deployed. So if it's a medical device deployed in a hospital, maybe you need physical access to exploit that vulnerability. Maybe it can be exploited remotely. Those are two different factors that go into that score. And knowing your device, knowing your system, and how it's deployed influences that. And so taking that into account when I was talking about context, and as you were saying it there, you're thinking more broadly about the device and the environment, the ecosystem that it's part of, and then analyzing that risk as part of that ecosystem, which I think is really important. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So this, I know we've talked about this a little bit, so just we can punt this question if we need to, but maybe there's more details that are worthy of discussing here. So with regards to what are some of the most common cybersecurity deliverables, like threat models, and we've talked about SBOMs a bit, that directly impact the patient safety assessments. Chad, do you have anything else to add on that front?
Yeah, I think the key is just knowing that in the transition from security assessment to patient safety assessment should occur within the security risk assessment. And then there's a number of deliverables that will be inputs into your security risk assessment, including your threat model, your any type of pen testing results, security vulnerability scans, security testing. Those will all cascade into the security risk assessment, where you'll then assess the security risk for acceptability and then potential for impacts to patient safety, and then hand off to the safety risk assessment there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Is making sure that you kind of close that loop, right? So you've done an initial assessment before you start, and after you do additional testing and post-market and all this stuff, making sure you're circling back with these risk assessments, making sure they're current with the latest data, latest testing, all that type of stuff. I think it is key as well.
Excellent. So, about 10 minutes left. I think we're gonna wrap up and with our very last question, unless the audience has any other questions. But I'd love to do a bit of a round robin on essentially if you could give one piece of advice or a best practice, right, to a manufacturer launching a connected medical device. what would it be to ensure cybersecurity is tied to patient safety from the start? Kyle, you want to get us started on this one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, a lot of my stuff is tied back to the quality and regulatory scope. So I think it's really starting early with your development. So the secure product development framework is key to planning and implementing these measures from early ideation, transferring from R&D into this is going to be a medical device product. So really making sure that when you start this software development plan and this is what we're going to build, that you have a good amount of resources and understanding and planning within the scope of all the cybersecurity measures you're going to take, and how you're going to execute and implement these tools, these tests, this risk assessment throughout the process. I think it is something that with a lot of our clients, we see that they get pretty far down the road and have not properly addressed this, and it will raise major delays, major questions with any FDA review, any 510(k), any EU review. All of these things will come up. The amount of documentation is continually getting more stringent. The E-Star updates have just added more and more cybersecurity requirements in the past few months. So even past what's in the current guidance, there's additional things that E-Stars are now calling for related to your cybersecurity, additional testing that wasn't necessarily required a year or two ago, right? So making sure that you have a strong plan and strong framework aligned with 14971, TIR 57 and 97 within the start of this project, I think is critical, and where we see a lot of companies have issues.
Yeah, I'll echo that advice as well. I think establishing and maintaining secure product development plans and procedures that take into account the total product lifecycle and align with the latest standards and guidances like the FDA guidance. We already mentioned TIR 57, TIR 97, SW 96, IEC 81001-5-1. All of these have a lot of overlap. So utilizing those as a tool to help build your procedures is key. Use the high watermark when it comes to the regulations and pay attention to how these are evolving and keep up with them so that you don't find yourself left behind. Do not try to reinvent the wheel. A lot of people have put a lot of thought into these standards and guidances. So using them as a method to kind of set your baseline and then looking forward is kind of a great way to make sure you're managing your program throughout its lifetime.
Those are fantastic points. I don't have a whole lot to add except to say, if to Chad's point there that just made, the very last thing he talked about is made me think of global regulations, and I'm not sure how many folks in the audience are thinking FDA and from US, or maybe others that are maybe commercially selling outside the US, but global regulations evolve just like FDA regulations evolve. And so if you're looking at product and you're pushing product globally, you want to keep an eye on what's happening around the globe. Most of it today, thankfully, is kind of following the same suit, but looking at FDA is probably a good start. But keep an eye on the global regulations and understand if you want to sell into other countries, what the requirements are there before even launching, because it's really important, as was brought up, to build that into your development process, the thought about the product before you even put it out there, how you're going to support it, how you're going to maintain it, and those kind of things, extremely important nowadays.
All fantastic advice. I can't thank each of you enough, Chad, Kyle, and Ken, for joining us today and for sharing your insights with the audience. And to the audience, thank you so much for joining. We appreciate your questions, and we're going to give you a few minutes back in your very busy day. Thanks again for joining, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, folks.